Welcome to TFE Talks, Navigating Wealth, Business, and Legacy, the podcast from Thomas Fisher and Edwards. Each episode, our attorneys bring you expert insight on estate planning, business strategy, and legacy building, breaking down complex topics into clear, actionable advice. Whether you're solidifying a strategy we've discussed or preparing for what's next, this podcast is your resource for thoughtful, practical planning. You ready? Let's dive in.
Hello and welcome to another edition of TFE Talks. I'm your host, Jordan Goewey, joined today by Matt Edwards, a shareholder here at Thomas Fisher and Edwards. As we like to say, he is the Edwards.
I am the Edwards.
And Matt, thanks for joining me on this live format of the podcast. You've been on a few versions of our other format, but this is the first time that we've been able to actually share a room together and podcast together.
Yeah, it's great to be here, and hopefully I can make this work well for us.
Yeah. And so today we're going to talk about a topic that can sound very complicated. So there's not really a good title for this, but we're going to be talking about indemnification provisions in purchase agreements. So just to kind of set the stage for this, what we're talking about is in a business deal. We represent a lot of businesses. We do a lot of mergers and acquisitions, especially on the sell side. We represent a lot of business owners and help them sell their businesses. And as part of a business sale, you, of course, have a purchase agreement, often an asset purchase agreement, sometimes a stock purchase agreement. And we won't do the full anatomy of a purchase agreement in this, but just to kind of hit the highlights of that, you obviously have your purchase price, which is what sellers care about when they initially get into a purchase agreement, because that's the money that they're going to receive. And then you get into all of the legalese on the back end of the agreement. And
Right.
So to kind of start you off with, before we can get really into indemnification provisions, why don't you tell us first what representations and warranties are, because that's going to really influence the importance of indemnification provisions.
Sure. So representations and warranties in a business transaction are promises in a classic straightforward sale where one party is just selling and one is buying. There's no other structure to that. It's just a straight purchase. Representations and warranties are promises that the seller makes to the buyer to say, about my business or my asset that I'm selling, here are all the things that are true about that. And I promise that those things are true. They're usually very involved in a 50, 60, 70-page purchase agreement, which is somewhat a longer form. Those promises may be a third of the overall transaction document.
Yeah, and those promises can range from my balance sheet and my income statement is true and correct and complete, and I've provided that to you. No one is suing me. I've not done anything that is going to lead to anyone suing me. And then it can get into really specialized areas like environmental law and things like that, depending on the type of business and how it operates and what risks apply. So, yes, it's essentially just promises that you're making as of that closing. And so once those promises are made, I think that's when we then get into this indemnification process, which really deals with what happens if those promises end up not being true or if they're broken in some way.
Right.
And so when we move into indemnification, who are typically the parties that are being indemnified or who are indemnifying? Who are those parties?
In a typical transaction for these indemnification provisions, which are really how someone gets paid if the promises turn out not to be true, if someone is damaged by one of those warranties or promises not being actually correct at the closing, that's what the indemnification provisions do. Both parties to a transaction are usually making promises. The buyer's promises are usually very limited.
Sure.
The buyer's basically saying, I can do this deal, and here's my money.
Right.
Right. And
our sellers are usually pretty satisfied with that as long as they get the money.
That's the goal, is to for our seller is to receive their funds, and the indemnification provisions are ways in which the buyer gets some money back if those promises aren't true. So usually the seller is making the bulk of the promises in that. And as we're representing a seller, we are the ones that are trying to both negotiate or limit the promises that are made to make sure they're not overly broad or overly burdensome, and also narrow the indemnification to say, for this insurance policy or this warranty that a seller is giving to their buyer, what are the edges of that? Right. What are the curbs?
Yeah, and I think that kind of gets into what I was going to ask you next, and I think that's very important. What should be the goal of the buyer, and what should be the goal of the seller when it comes to these indemnification provisions?
Just like the buyer wants to have the price be as low as possible, and the seller wants it to be as high as possible. The buyer wants very expansive indemnification provisions to have higher dollar amounts, to last longer time periods, and the seller wants the converse. They want shorter time periods, that these promises only last a limited period of time, and that they be for smaller amounts as much as we can. And as I use the insurance policy analogy, they want a smaller deductible. They want to say, buyer, you're responsible for a few things on this.
Yeah, and I've heard you describe it as an insurance policy before, which really is a good way of thinking about it. And what I tell my clients is that when you're the seller, you really want to be able to sell this business and walk away and never have to worry about it again. Whereas when you're the buyer, you really want to buy the business, but you also want to sort of buy an insurance policy with this business that says, hey, if I ever find any issues, I'm going to come back and get some of that money that I paid you back.
Absolutely.
And so yeah, that's a helpful way to look at it. So let's talk about primarily on the sell side, when we're helping a owner sell their business, what are some of the ways that we try to limit these indemnities to protect that seller so that they feel like the money that they get paid is going to actually remain with them? So one of the initial ways that we do that is with baskets and deductibles, which you kind of alluded to a moment ago. And so can you talk about those in some detail?
So sure, a basket or first dollar indemnification provision versus a true deductible indemnification provision are really two ways in which, if there is a promise that turns out not to be true and the buyer is harmed, at what point does the seller have to give money back to the buyer? With a basket or first dollar type, if there are a host of claims or one large claim that goes above a certain dollar limit, our seller will have to pay back to $1 so that the buyer is not hurt at all in this. The buyer has, in one sense, no skin in the game on that once it reaches a certain level. A true deductible type is more commonly what we see for our own personal insurance policies. Mm-hmm. That would say, if there are claims, the buyer is responsible for the first host of claims, the first up to a dollar limit, and only after that dollar limit does the seller have to reimburse the buyer in some way.
Yeah, and yeah, like you said, I mean, that's just like what most people think about with their health insurance or other insurance, where it's, a certain amount is kind of on the insured party to cover no matter what. And I always try my best to negotiate those for my clients on that sell side, because I see that as essentially like free money that they're getting in a way, and they can kind of say, look, don't bother me unless this ends up being enough of an issue that there's really a reason for me to indemnify you on this. And so we certainly push for that. Another way that we try to protect sell-side clients in M&A transactions is with caps on liability. And so how do caps typically work?
So with caps, there are a maximum amount that the seller may have to reimburse the buyer. Mm-hmm. And those are often vary based on the type of promise that is being made. And I use the explanation as I'm negotiating with buyer's counsel to say every business has some issues. Mm-hmm. There's some things, some we made a mistake in our accounting, or we forgot this, that are not major issues. Those are the run-of-the-mill promises, but they may show up and they may cause problems. And so we would have a cap that could be for certain types of warranties, but there's also I want the benefit of the whole bargain. You're selling me this business, and I need to get that. And if I don't get that, I need to get my money back. But we don't want that to be unlimited. We want our seller to have a maximum amount that they may have to give that back. Usually we will push for that to be the absolute maximum that we may have to give back is our purchase price, less whatever taxes that we would have to pay on that, so that our seller is never in a worse position because of some fundamental problem with their business that they didn't know.
Right.
On that.
Yeah, and for those more general promises that they're making, we usually push for a much lower cap on that, usually just some small portion of the purchase price.
It's usually a percentage,
Yeah.
and our deductible or basket amount is usually a percentage of the overall purchase price. And we use tools and studies, both our experience, but also we have access to some resources that are deal studies from multiple sources where we can compare and contrast a lot of different deals that we've seen and others that have seen, so that we can draw on those resources and negotiate and push for the benefit of our clients.
Yeah, certainly. There's a lot of information out there that helps us determine what those market terms are, and then we kind of negotiate within that and do the best we can within those market terms. I think another important consideration, so we've talked about how do we limit the overall amount that a buyer or that a seller may have to pay for these indemnification provisions, but another important consideration is how long do they have to worry about it. We don't want our seller to sell their business and have to worry about it for 10 years that the buyer is going to come back and make some claim against them. So do these promises that they're making and this right to indemnification that the buyer has, do these usually last forever, or is there typically going to be some cutoff date at some point?
There's usually a cutoff date. For someone warranting that this is my business and I own it, that promise usually lasts forever. You're promising title on that. But for all of all of the run-of-the-mill promises, this is my list of employees, I paid my taxes, those sorts of things, there's going to be some time limit on that. A good analogy on this is back to our warranty, is a car warranty. Mm-hmm. So there may be a more advanced warranty for bigger systems and a smaller warranty for smaller things. We see that as well. All of these limits are interrelated. So major issues, fundamental issues, would have higher dollar limits of where the maximum amount to pay back would be, and would have longer periods of time, what we would call fundamental representations, and they would have fundamental indemnification provisions. And then your general basic representations and warranties would have more time limited and more dollar limited indemnification provisions.
And we're typically pushing for closer to a year or so on those. And the way I kind of look at that is, if someone buys the business and they can't uncover these supposed issues that are problematic, if they can't uncover them within a year or so, then they must not have been that big of an issue.
Absolutely.
So it makes sense that at some point in time you have to kind of cut it off and let the seller feel comfortable that they're going to keep what they were paid for the business. So once we actually get to the point where there's been an indemnification claim, and let's say that the parties agree, yes, there was this issue. The seller says, sure, I promised this thing. It ended up not being true. Sorry about that. I'll indemnify you. Where does that money come from? Is it typically coming out of the seller's pocket at that point in time? Or is there money reserved in some way for this through escrows and holdbacks and things of that nature?
Well, we always push representing a seller that we want to have all of our money and we want to be able to do what we want with that until there's an indemnification event and payback. Buyers will usually want to reserve some funds in some safe location in their mind so that there is a source of funds to pay those indemnification claims. The two main places where money is held back would be the term used, which is a holdback or an escrow. A holdback is where the buyer will actually retain a portion of the funds, and then if there is a indemnification claim, then they can basically pay themselves from that. And if the time limit expires where there's no indemnification claim, then those funds are paid over to the seller.
Right.
An escrow agreement is an arrangement where funds are put in the hands of a neutral third party, usually a financial institution, to hold. And there's a procedure where those funds are released either to the buyer or the seller in the event of an indemnification event to the buyer, or at the end of an indemnification period to the seller if there's no claims.
Yeah, and all these things are negotiated, as you pointed out. Obviously, our preference is that the seller gets the money, and maybe they have to come out of pocket to pay it back if there's a claim. The buyer, of course, would rather that they get to hold back money and keep it in their hands. A lot of times we end up with that middle ground of there's a neutral third party that holds it in an escrow. And then even there's negotiation, because we may want to negotiate that it's going to be invested in some way while it's being escrowed, and that all of those investment returns come to seller if there were no claims made, or to the extent that there's money left, because we want it, at least earning some money for them in a very safe, conservative way. And so all these things are very negotiated throughout the process. But I think that that's a good overview of the main negotiating points that arise with indemnification provisions. So I think based on everything we've talked about today, it's clear that indemnification provisions, though they're not kind of the headliner of a deal, these are a place where we can help clients a lot in negotiating an asset purchase agreement or negotiating a stock purchase agreement. But of course, clients are always going to look at that headline purchase price. That's the thing that comes to mind. And a lot of times, if they get that purchase price, if they get that offer that they want, then they're going to want to do the deal. And we have to kind of explain to them the importance of these other more legal type provisions. And so how do you help clients understand the trade-offs between purchase price and indemnification risk as you're helping them kind of analyze a deal and decide whether to move forward with it?
From my standpoint, my client knows their business and its value far better than I do on that. I'm really relying on the client, and I can help a client engage with an investment banker or an appraiser to determine that value. Value is up to the client. These legal provisions really need to be discussed and understand with someone who has experience. Some of our clients, our sellers, have experience. They've sold multiple businesses, but a lot of clients have never had that experience. And so we want to educate our clients as early as possible in the process, often 3 to 5 years in advance of a sale. We want to have a conversation to help a client understand, what does a deal look like? What's the time frame? What's the flow of that? And how can a client make their business look better to a prospective buyer, so that our indemnification provisions and our representations and warranties are much more limited? When we get to a potential sale, in my experience, buyers come in with a letter of intent, an offer, where that has all of the good stuff in it. This is the price, and it's all going to be great. And then the lawyers come in, and then we have to talk about all the bad stuff. Our best time to negotiate the bad stuff for a selling client is at that early stage, at the letter of intent stage, before there's anything signed, and also before our selling client has really spent a lot of time and energy and shared confidential information with a prospective buyer. We want to get all the good stuff and the bad stuff out in front, so that our selling client is comfortable with the total deal that they're going to walk away with, not just, oh, this is a purchase price, and then we see a very onerous set of promises and indemnification provisions that we have to try to negotiate away from farther on in the deal.
Yeah, certainly. And that's a really good point on that timeline as well. I think sellers have the highest level of bargaining power very early in the process and before that letter of intent is signed. And a lot of times we get those letters of intent and they don't even touch on these indemnification provisions that are very important. And so to the extent that we can go ahead and sort out some of these details early in the process, then it helps us talk to our client and weigh the overall deal, not just the purchase price, but also the risk that they may have to give some of that purchase price up, depending on how the indemnification provisions work. And so, Matt, I think that this was a great discussion on a very important topic and something that I think is important for business owners to understand, especially if they are thinking about selling their business. So thanks for joining me today. And again, for being in the same room with me here with the new format for the podcast. And I look forward to having you join me for future episodes as well.
Thanks, Jordan. My pleasure.
And thanks to all of our listeners as well for joining us. Once again, if anyone has any topics that they would like us to touch on in future episodes, feel free to drop a comment on whatever listening platform you have, and we will certainly consider doing some of those topics as well. Thanks again.
Thanks for listening to TFE Talks. For more information, please visit our website at www.tfelawfirm.com. You can also follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram by clicking the links below in the show notes. If you have any questions about topics discussed in the episode, or you have recommendations for future topics, please email us at info@tfelawfirm.com. See you next time.